Hello, everyone. My name is Odie. I will be moderating today's discussion. For a day job, I look after security at a company called Ethos. It is a startup, a Series C startup for that matter, and I deal with a lot of the things that we'll be discussing on a daily basis. I'm joined here by three peers. I would let them introduce themselves, and I will also ask them to mention a fun fact about themselves, something that shows that in their daily lives, they're not all about control. So, Marzena?
Marzena Fuller, Chief Security Officer at SignalFX. I lead the entire security practice from application security to infrastructure security, compliance, and privacy. And a fun fact, well, I recently picked up my high school hobby, which was painting, and I'm lucky to live right on the water. And when I have time, I paint what I see outside, which is mostly container ships and Port of Auckland.
Talha?
Sure. My name is Talha. I'm the Chief Security Officer at HashiCorp, previously at Microsoft and PwC. Fun fact about me, I'm a photographer. And I like to disagree with Odie on stage.
We'll get a little bit into that today, you'll see.
Hi, Dave Latrope. I run security for Cisco Meraki. I didn't come up with a fun fact. I guess I'm wearing I made two of the things I'm wearing right now, so.
Very cool, very nice. Well, thanks to everyone. So now the topic today, everyone's favorite topic, is cloud security. And how do we go about it? As we tailor our discussion today, I'm trying to basically make sure we straddle the right line between going in the weeds, in the technical details, or staying a little bit at a high level. So we'll try to do that. So the first question, cloud security or cloud infrastructure security, because we'll focus on infrastructure primarily, not the typical SaaS applications. So it means a lot of things to a lot of people. So what does it mean to you? What are the buckets that you consider to be part of the cloud security? So maybe we start with you, Marzena.
Definitely. When I think about cloud security from infrastructure perspective, it's AWS, it's GCP, it's Azure. And in order to be successful with establishing best practices, first of all, you need to understand what is the shared responsibility model, which means like, what are the providers responsible for vis-a-vis what are you responsible for? That's number one. From my experience, number two is having a comprehensive identity and access management strategy. Because of the advantages of cloud, because you can deploy resources quickly, because you can scale resources quickly. That also means that there's a lot of risk associated with that speed and wide access, and you need to be able to limit that in an appropriate way. And lastly, a comprehensive monitoring strategy. And for example, AWS provides you with all of the resources like CloudTrail, and you can trace all of the API calls, but you have to be able to capture that data and extract meaningful and actionable insight. And only then you are able to have full visibility and control over your infrastructure.
Got it. So if I understand correctly, understand exactly what the cloud provides you and what you're responsible for. So if the cloud is a pile of wood, it's up to you to design, to use the wood to build something that will withstand whatever you're trying to do. Secondly was understanding the identity and access, managing that. And thirdly is gaining visibility. Talha, do you have...
I think there are various ways to slice and dice cloud, and you have your three major public cloud providers, but a lot of on-prem infrastructure is also a private cloud. So HashiCorp tends to see cloud as a very cloud agnostic way. I think what's really important is, generally speaking, your cloud is composed of different layers: compute, network, storage, and then a bunch of services that glue all these things together. And different cloud providers have different services. What's really important, to Marzena's point, is to understand, one, what security responsibility the provider is taking care of and what is your responsibility. And then around those responsibilities, what are the applications and services and tools that you have to gain visibility, to control access, to protect your data.
If you set up when you set up your cloud environment, you have two main buckets to me. One is a control panel and one is a workload, right? And they each have independently the same type of controls. Is that your take as well?
I think going back to each product, service, or organization will think through some of the things differently, and it's very context specific in what your application and service is, and how do you think through the security requirements. And again, in the context of the products and services you're looking at, there's a bunch of security controls that come out of the box that you leverage. CloudTrail is one of them, access control is one of them, data protection is one of them, monitoring is one of them. But then you also have to think through, how do you protect your business and what other fraud, abuse cases that you need to worry about, and how do you communicate trust in your product and service. So I think it's a spectrum of things, and there's no one answer that fits everybody.
Got it. Same topic. What are the categories, the buckets?
Yeah. So I don't think there's anything special about cloud. With everything, you need to focus on preventing as many mistakes as possible, noticing when things have gone wrong, when prevention has failed, and then having a clean response at the end. So depending on your maturity, you might have a really basic answer to each of those, but you should have thought through them at least like a baseline level as you're setting things up. To your earlier question about how do you think about the control plane versus your workload, some of the basics that small companies fall down on are things as simple as making sure your root account is set up the right way to prevent takeovers. So I would definitely run through those simpler things first to lay a foundation before you even start worrying about the inbuilt security tools, which are absolutely something you should take advantage of. That's possibly the main benefit of going public cloud is that you get to stand on the shoulders of giants. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. You don't have to come up with all of your own vendor vetting. There's just a lot of stuff already built in.
Yeah, thank you. And that was kind of the point that before you start building a workload, you better set up the control panel. You better go in there and kind of envision the longer term model. This is how I plan to manage this environment. If you start with the workload and then go try to make the control panel work, that may require some revisiting.
So I think I understand your question better now, and I think the best analogy I can give you, I like to think in terms of trust boundaries. Your trust boundary and your threat profile of external-facing service is pretty different from something which is internal-facing. So what kind of security boundaries and controls you can implement for each layer of these trust boundaries is super important.
Got it. So that kind of drives the next point. So you're a startup, you have limited resources, you're building a product, which is the main thing you're trying to do. And now you basically got to prioritize. How do you go about prioritizing what you do from a security perspective in the cloud? We talked about the control panel, kind of setting it up right in the first place. That takes a little bit of time, but still, there's some things that you should do and something that maybe you can punt. So what is your take on what should you do? What's the first thing you would do? How do you prioritize?
As a CEO, the first thing you should think about when you think about security is hiring an experienced technical leader who will help you to understand what are the priorities and how we should address them. And the reason this is important is that security is table stakes right now for a lot of companies. And especially when you are early stage or mid stage startup, it's important to, number one, limit your risk exposure, and number two, bake in security in every single process that you have in place and make it true a core tenet of your company.
So, Martina, just because I'm argumentative, I was going to say that if I'm a 6-person company, I'm just not going to hire a security person at that point. So maybe I still need to do something, to secure this environment. Because look, I'm starting to build a product. I have some code, and I'm going to say, look, I want to do kind of a proof of concept. I want to show people what I built. So how without hiring someone, what's your take on how you would approach this?
Well, two things. It's ownership and it's subject matter expertise. If you don't have a dedicated person who has the ownership of a security program, then you have to install that ownership in your engineering leadership and in senior engineers, so that number one, they are responsible for security, and that very closely ties into the DevSecOps model, where engineering groups are responsible for security. The same, they're responsible for reliability.
Right.
So that is a big part of that. And then providing them with resources to be able to learn, because not everybody is subject matter expert in security, but if you're a good engineer, you can learn very easily and translate the engineering concepts into security concepts.
Got it. So Tala, if I can go in the same line. You're setting up your first AWS account. You got an idea, you got a product. What do you do the first things? We talked a little bit about the control plane. How do you approach that? And what were the first couple of things that you would prioritize in setting up the control plane, setting up your first workloads?
Yeah, I think I'll answer first on how you should think about building a security program. And if you were founding a company, especially for founders in the room, if you're a 2-people startup or a 10-people startup, and you may not think through at certain stage to bring in a full-time security person, talk to your advisors, talk to your VCs, they're very well connected, talk to your peers, go reach out in the security community. Oren talked about the framework we open source, which is security for startups. It's very well laid out in terms of security controls which are expected for a seed company, Series A company, Series B company. So there is knowledge material out there. There is plenty of expertise out there. You can bring in somebody as an advisor, just like you bring in legal expertise or finance expertise, even though you may not hire a CFO day one, but you go talk to a finance professional. You may not have a general counsel, but you go talk to a legal professional. So security is not, any different if you think about, what do you build when. I think that's basically where you start. At a certain scale, you might want to bring in, full-time security people. In that case, what Mardana was referring to, bring in a leader first who can think through based on where the company is going, a year to a year in advance of what else is coming, what security, privacy, regulatory compliance requirements you would need to adhere to, how should you think about building a strategy in the program. So that's one. I think in terms of what you should do, I'd say a lot of security is about risk management. There's no perfect security, and you address security controls based on the environment you're operating in, the service you're selling, and what your threat profile is. And unfortunately, the industry is really bad at threat modeling, and individuals are also really bad at threat modeling. But I think a very simple start is just think through what are the top 5 things that will go wrong, depending on what service you're selling. If you were Uber for X, okay, what are the prevailing threats around selling something as Uber X? If you were dealing with a large amount of PII, how should you think about risks to PII? If you're operating in a regulatory environment, what kind of risk do you need to adhere to? If you're selling a fintech service, what is your core asset you're protecting? So understanding the threat model is super important to figure out what your security program needs to do and what you should protect and how you should protect and, how you should think through building a security program.
Okay, so I have to say that I'm looking for a more specific answer because so far it has been very general. Regardless of that will be your choice, but let me kind of explain what I have in mind. So when you set up something, at the end of the day, yes, you got the risk, and that's going to be your workload. That's going to be your application, the way you build your service or your application. But you also have this cloud provider that gives you this framework to build something with. So it's like somebody gives you a bunch of, I don't know, whatever, cement, bricks, whatever, and you're trying to build a house. So what should you be mindful of when you build this house? What are kind of the first things? And yes, you should have a blueprint and so forth. But practically, what would be the kind of things that you're very likely to regret later on if you don't do initially and setting up cloud?
So the way I think about this is trying to lay a strong foundation for the things that would be very, very painful to change if you don't do them right up front. There are a lot of things that you can do later, and it's not terribly different. If you get a pen test too early, it's not going to be very meaningful for your organization. So the things I think about are patching, build it to change, and visibility, know what's happening in your environment and what you have. Both of those are going to serve a variety of needs for you in terms of reliability and development speed, and they're also it's impossible to build a good security program without those two things being met. If you don't know what you have out in your environment, if you aren't able to apply patches, and it doesn't matter how good your security program is or what bugs you're finding, because you're not going to be able to close those holes.
Got it. Yeah, and from my perspective, oftentimes the first thing you do, you set up an environment, you're going to give access to everyone to whatever account you're going to have. Maybe the few things you could do, set up a couple of different environments, set up a production separate from development. Just buy some single sign-on licenses and integrate with a single sign-on provider. Set yourself up in a way that you don't have to do the cleanup later. And I think the security framework for startups, not that we're going to talk too much about it, but that gives you some kind of an idea of what we've seen as things that eventually, if you don't do, they'll require a lot of cleanup later.
Yeah, I think if I had to choose one, for me, it would be access control. I mean, you provision access to people, you provision access to machines, things talk to each other, people talk to each other. It's about access, and it's probably the number one area where a lot of companies fail, and that security debt just keeps on growing if you don't handle it day one.
Yeah.
MFA everywhere.
MFA everywhere.
One only thing.
Yeah, so exactly. MFA everywhere. The other thing is if you create private versus public subnets or VPCs, just make sure you don't put things in the wrong place. It's not easy to move at a later point in time. So again, take a look at the framework and you may see a few of these recommendations. Now, going back to our agenda, one of the good things about the cloud providers is they give you a lot of things. Like when you build a house, they give you the electrical wires and everything so you can build. But oftentimes the wire only works in that particular environment. So you kind of get locked in. So for instance, you use AWS KMS, you're stuck with AWS. It's not going to, you can move to Google, but it's going to be a little painful. So how do you avoid that? What's the pros and cons for doing this? And Dave, maybe we start with you.
Yeah, so we're starting with me because I have the contrarian view on this. I don't think it's worth worrying about when you're a smaller company. The whole point of being on these providers is that you can make use of all of the extended functionality they offer. Getting off of them and diversifying is a later problem.
Right. And I think, Talha, for instance, HashiCorp has the Vault. You know, you can use Vault and you can use it in AWS, and you can use it anywhere. Why would anyone start with KMS and versus doing so? What's your take about being locked in and about having the flexibility?
Yeah, I think that there are two ways to think about the problem. The problem number one is, build versus buy versus use decision, and you should, build what is your core differentiator and your core product, and not worry about, doing the same work, which is a solved problem, especially if it's not your core secret sauce. And that drives decision of which cloud provider to go to, and what's a commodity service, and what you should just leverage out of the box, whether it's Google or Amazon or GCP, or if you are in some other market, some other cloud. So that's typically how you drive the decision. In terms of which tool to use, which secret manager to use, which identity platform to use, I think you have to think about if eventually your product doesn't, even if you're cloud native, even if you build everything in AWS, you will always have integrations with other SaaS platforms, other tools, other integrations, other applications which are not on AWS. So we tend to think of these as like workflow problems. So like secrets management is a workflow problem. You may have application X sitting outside AWS talking to some infrastructure middleware sitting inside AWS. So the more you start, each cloud service has their own maturation of like, not every service is like a tier 1 service. Some of them are like experimentation services. But if you're multi-cloud, if you're talking to various things, we tend to see these as like workflow problems, and that's where we're all plugged in.
Got it. So if I understand correctly, know your capabilities and optimize for whatever you're trying to achieve in your capabilities. And yes, being locked in the cloud is not going to be the end of the world. In some cases, it makes sense. In some cases, it doesn't. So again, lots of homework, no single answer. Going on to the next topic, and we won't start with Talha, even though he has his company has a stake in this, and a big one too. But we'll start with Marzinat. So let's talk about infrastructure as code, if I may. So the idea being, if you're going to build something in a cloud or more than one, you can start in a number of ways. You can go to a console, set up some things. You can set up the workloads manually through a CLI and so forth. But you can also do it through code. And what happens if you try from the beginning to build it through code? Because if you do it through code, say Terraform, essentially everything that you do from that point on can be managed through code. So what's your take on this? Is this something some companies should start from an early stage?
I would say absolutely. It's not only infrastructure as a code, but also security as a code would play in very nicely there, where you can define all of the configurations, be that for infrastructure or for your security within a code, and truly enable your engineering teams to be part of the DevSecOps model. And from my experience, that is really the only model that security can scale, because as the company is growing from 100 people to 500 people, you will not be able to hire sufficient number of security engineers to keep up with that demand. But you will have much easier job on your hands if you incorporate those practices in your code. And then if your engineering team is partly in ownership there.
Got it. Hey, do you concur that it's worth taking the time? Perhaps it's a little more if you don't have the experience, should some founder take time and get themselves familiar with doing infrastructure as code?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's more important if you don't have the experience, because you're much more likely to accidentally make a rookie mistake and blow away a customer instance and then have a very bad day.
Yeah, and from my experience, I'm in 2 companies now, one that did not follow infrastructure as code, and there was a massive amount of cleanup. And then later on, the attempt was to do that and use Terraform. In my current environment, we're trying to build everything from scratch with Terraform and have the ability to manage, recreate, and take care of it. So Tal, I think obviously HashiCorp, big player in this space. What's your take? To what extent do you believe this should be the one must do?
Yeah, I think it's just where the market is pulling, us in that direction, as well as if you see the growth of the cloud players, as well as entities which are moving to the cloud, and open source adoption and programmable infrastructure, that's squarely where we play in. I think there are tons of benefits of using infrastructure as code and programmable infrastructure because one, you could label them, version them, think through the dependencies much more clearly. If you look at on GitHub, HashiCorp configuration language is like the top 3, if I'm not wrong, in terms of the programming language which is getting the most adoption. There are tons of benefits in going through that. But two, I think from security perspective, it's also way easier to rationalize what security and policy controls you should have. So we tend to think of policy as code as a framework where once you have dozens of developers collaborating on what your infrastructure should look like, it's very hard for security teams to catch up on infrastructure issues, configuration issues, how to think about security. And what they can do is just start adding very simple policies like, okay, my policy says you should not have root without an MFA on. My policy says you should not have external security groups allowing traffic. So you could just add like 1 or 2 lines of policies, and then your infrastructure as code honors those policies. It also helps reduce the blast radius significantly. As your teams grow, they're working on like specific areas. Some might be service focused, infrastructure focused, middleware focused, and then you can separate out those concerns and look at chunks of infrastructure more cleanly.
Yeah, and I think Sentinel, in the case of Terraform, it's a great option. Encourage you to, if you're going to use Terraform, use Sentinel, build some guardrails. The other thing that it enables you to, I think, is the self-service. By creating a specific framework, you can allow people to self-service themselves and not expose yourself to an unknown amount of risk. All right, now the next topic is slightly different. We're going to talk about remote access. It's slightly different, but it's related. So say you build this environment in one or more cloud environments. So you got to manage it. How do you do that? Because all of a sudden you've got a CLI that can be used from anywhere. You've got a console that, unless you put some pretty smart solution, anyone can access it from anywhere. And then you got your workloads that you need to get to. And the question is, do you really need to get to the workloads? That's the other question. Can you build them so you don't have to get there? There is all Ansible code, and it's all Terraform, it's all orchestrated. But say you're not there yet, so you build stuff and you still need to get to it. How do you do that in a way that straddles both safety, productivity, and ease of use? So, Dave, do you want to chime on this?
It's a little bit of a hit to productivity, but I still think like the earlier you can tolerate having a jump host in place so that you're not just having people connect from their home networks and all these other places, it's really going to benefit you. Getting that auditing in place, having confidence that all of your data isn't going to just walk out the door really, really helps.
So would you think that that's one of the first things you should do as you build your workload?
No, for sure. But I would say by the time you have like live customers in your environment, it's something you should be thinking about.
So going down this line, is it too late at that point? Because if you had an SSH, you allowed SSH in your environment, and you've had it for a couple of months, or maybe like 6 months before you actually have a customer. Is that too much of a risk? Do you think, or do you think the watershed moment is when you have a client? And
I mean, the correct time to make a security change is always yesterday.
Right.
So no matter when you're kind of looking at it, I think it still makes sense.
Got it. Marjana, what's your take?
It's based on my experience, there are a couple of things that are very important to do first. Zero trust security is a concept that is getting a lot of traction. And when you really look at beyond the word itself, what does it mean? How to implement that is being able to ensure that your access is being granted based on risk, like what IP address are you coming from? Is your behavior matching the previous behavior patterns? And be able to identify and provision access dynamically to the users and revoke it when the behavior is not what is expected. That's now one element. The other one is providing logging of what actually happens when your engineers are accessing the environment and they do have SSH access to the instances, or they do have access to production data via front end which is sometimes necessary to provide support. But being able to have those logs for your own use and then for customers' use is critical for your visibility. And lastly, look at what are the trends? Like, what are we supposed to be doing with SSH? And SSH certs is something that I like a lot, where your access is ephemeral and can be revoked and can be tied to a specific IP address.
Got it. So it sounds like everyone is saying, do something, don't just allow free access to your environment without any type of management at all. Kind of not going back to infrastructure as code, because it's not just infrastructure, now it's the management of the systems. Do you see really a need, if somebody was building something from scratch, how often do you see a need for people to actually get to the workload through actually direct connections versus using the same CI/CD to manage their changes to the systems?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a need because even if you're doing infrastructure as code, it's a static piece of code which is not running your applications yet, and a lot of interesting issues you'll find come in production when you have real data, real customers, real applications, scale issues, performance issues. So there's obviously need for debugging and things of those nature.
Why not just take the logs? I mean, one thing is like you can take the logs and put them somewhere.
Yeah, so. I mean, look, I tend to see these things as like crawl, walk, run. And, if you start putting in too much security when you are a 2 people or 10 people company, what do humans do? They'll avoid, the gates that you put in, and they'll just take the shortcuts on the, most efficient, easy way possible. But I also think there's value in thinking about, what kind of service you're offering. If you're offering a security service, the bar is high, right? I mean, you should absolutely think about who has access, when do they need access, why do they need privileged access, how do you think through accountability and auditability aspect of it, and how can you rationalize why that privileged access is needed, every day, every month, every week. So there are patterns that you can think through to avoid this problem to become a big problem in the first place.
Got it. So if I was to summarize, do something about it from the beginning. In other words, set up a VPN service, use a VPN service. Most of the cloud providers give you some capability similar to VPN that secures the access to your workloads. Try to restrict access to your consoles as much as possible. It's a little more complicated to restrict access to particular devices and so forth, but try to do something about this remote access from the beginning.
Yeah, I think the security problems of 10 people company are very different than security problems of somebody like Netflix, right? I mean, at that scale, you have very different problems of automation, of access. When you're a 10 people company, there are very simple things you can do. Document the 5 people that need privileged access. Think through only provisioning just-in-time access and not having a blanket admin shared by 10 people all the time.
Yeah, and I think you're setting precedent. Think about the things you do, and you're setting precedent. If the culture becomes that everyone gets VPN access, and you've reached 30, 40 people, then that will be the expectation. It's going to be harder to go and take it away or change it at that point. But bottom line is, try to do something. This is important. All right, so going to the next topic. Let's talk a little about encryption, cloud encryption. And we talked a little bit about KMS here. KMS may be one piece of that puzzle. Suppose you have a workload, you define an application, and say you're a company that's going to do something for a client, and that client is giving you their API keys, say, to their Google account. And they're going to say, well, yes, you're going to provide a service for me. I'm going to give you the client says, I'm fine, you want my API keys. What are you going to do with them? And are you going to encrypt them? And then how? And kind of how do you approach this? Kind of what's your take? Do you use how do you approach it in the cloud environment? And what's the pros and cons? So Tal, maybe we start with you.
Oh, with me? Oh, yeah. Okay. I think the first question you need to ask is what problem you're trying to solve. And oftentimes the use of KMS or some encryption tool is actually an access control problem. Like you are trying to prevent, think through access and authorization to some piece of data. And you could encrypt that data, but then you have to decrypt it for somebody to have access to it. And then again, it becomes an access control problem, not an encryption problem. So if you separate out the use cases of when do you need access control and when do you need data protection, those things drive what kind of security and data encryption and key management system that you need.
That's right. So in a way, it is key management or access control because your workloads need access to this data, so you've got to build in this whole capability. But then, is it really, as you approach it, so let's talk about a specific example. should you encrypt your S3 buckets if your policy says that all your systems can decrypt the S3 buckets? How much is that going to buy for you?
So there's security controls, and they tend to cater to either risk reduction or meeting some compliance obligations. Some of the compliance standards were written in, pre-cloud world, your, HIPAAs and HITRUST and PCIs. They are infrastructure technology agnostic, so oftentimes you may have to implement encryption to meet a specific regulatory environment. Oftentimes you do encryption, for security and data protection.
Got it. All right, so Dad, maybe go to you and ask you, what's your view on encryption in the cloud?
Honestly, for a young company, I think about kind of meeting the basics. So don't go crazy trying to implement Vault if you're not there yet, but do at least do field level encryption, make sure your disks are encrypted. Disk encryption also being one of those things, by the way, that's painful to change later on. If you don't start there, then having to do that migration is often slow and costly.
So you think of EBS volume encryption, and to what extent do you think doing encryption for the sake of satisfying customers? For instance, I'm going to have a client that's likely going to ask me that. Do you think it's worth doing it, even though it's like painting the windowsills? Do you think it's worth doing it from day one?
I do. When you're looking at, you've had some relatively basic breach and now somebody has a dump of your passwords, you're having a very different conversation with your customers if they have to decrypt all those or brute force them than if they're just sitting in plain text. That's very embarrassing for your business.
Got it. And I think, Martina, you will be the closing on this. What's your take?
First of all, you have to understand your threat exposure, exposure, and why you're encrypting the data, as Taha mentioned. And when customers are asking you, is your data encrypted? Like, what does it really mean? Are you talking about the disk encryption? Are you talking about the field level encryption? And just understanding why you want to do that and how you're reducing your risk exposure is critical. And then you can decide how you're going to implement that. And using KMS is very useful because then you don't have to worry about the lifecycle management of your keys, which quite often is completely, not addressed by a lot of early stage companies.
Got it. So message, leverage encryption when necessary. If you can build it in without creating a significant overhead, just to satisfy potential requirements from your clients, worth doing it. With KMS also, be careful the way you set it up. So it's all in IAM, it's tied in with your access control. So it is an access control problem at that point. That's all we have time for today, but I wanted to thank you, all of you, for this.